Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We are delighted to have with us tonight Thrity Umrigar, and thank you to so many of you that were registered for her original program back in April. We had a terrible storm that night, and we're so lucky that we were able to reschedule for tonight. So thank you so much for being here. My name is Allison. I work in the Adult Services Department, and it's my honor to have a conversation tonight with one of my favorite authors, Thrity Umrigar. I've read most of her books, and I'm sure many of you have as well. When I read The Museum of Failures that came out in September 2023, I came into work and I told Polly, my boss, I said, we have to get Thrity back. Her newest book was wonderful. So I'm so glad we have this opportunity tonight. She joined us back in 2022 for a virtual program when Honor was released, and since that time she has written yet another beautifully written story, The Museum of Failures. Thrity Umrigar is the best-selling author of 9 previous novels, including Honor, which was a Reese's book club pick, as well as 3 children's books and a memoir. Her books have been published in over 15 countries and in several languages. Her articles have been published in national publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Boston Globe. She was a recipient of the Nieman Fellowship to Harvard and winner of the Cleveland Arts Prize, the Seth Rosenberg Prize, and the Lambda Literary Award. She's currently a distinguished university professor of English at Case Western Reserve University. And tonight's author event is in recognition of the Celebrating Ohio Book Awards and Authors Grant Program. In 2024, the Hudson Library was a recipient of this grant through the Federal Institute of Museum and Library Services Funds, which is granted through the State Library of Ohio. And this grant allows libraries to expand their collection of Ohio authors and Ohio-based literary awards. So we are excited to have been a recipient of that grant. And of course, we are delighted to have with us a local Ohio author. So we're delighted to have you tonight, Thrity. Well, let me begin by saying what an honor it is to sit here with you tonight. How many of you have read Museum of Failures just by? Wonderful. So that's great. Tonight we're going to talk a little bit about, we're going to learn a little bit more about Thrity, and I'm sure she'll give us a little bit of preview about her book if you haven't read it yet. But we also want to save some time for audience questions, and then of course at the end we'll have time to have your book signed if you purchased a book tonight or if you just want to chat with her for a few minutes. So we'll go ahead and get started. In many of your books, including The Museum of Failures, you introduced your readers to the Parsi community. For those of us that don't know much about it, can you talk a little bit about the Parsi community?
Sure. But can I just take a minute to, first of all, thank all of you for being here and apologize for canceling and bailing out on you, I guess, sometime in May when the original date was. So it's funny, we got here, I live in Cleveland, so it's impossible to know how long it'll take to get here, especially during rush hour. So we left pretty early and got here very early and wandered around without, looking for you initially, and honestly thought that there was nobody attending today. Because, the library, outside just looked dead. It didn't occur to me to sort of make a left as soon as we walked in. So I'm walking around. We went to the second floor, nobody there. And I was like, we should have never canceled in May, right? So, but here you all are, and here we are all together. So thank you again for being here. Thank you for inviting me. Yeah. The Parsi community. So I actually, my very first novel dealt exclusively with the Parsi community, and then I veered away from that for a long, long time, and sort of came back to it with the Museum of Failures. Mm-hmm. This is basically the community that I was raised in India. So the Parsis are practitioners of this ancient faith called Zoroastrianism. brownie points to any of you who have heard the word, and a gold star if any of you know how to spell it. I mean, I can barely do it. I have to write it out in order to get it right. But so my ancestors came to India from Persia like 1,000 years ago. And, you know, Persia was what today we would mostly recognize as Iran, right? And the story goes that, you know, when the local people, the original people of Persia, when the Arab conquests happened, many of them converted to Islam. But a handful really decided that they would seek their fortunes elsewhere. And a small group of them ended up on the shores of India. And there is actually a beautiful legend about how they arrived in India and why they were let in, because in today's parlance, we would say that they were political refugees, right? And there was a cultural difference, there was a linguistic difference. There was no reason on earth for the Hindu ruler of that region to have allowed them in. But he did, and I actually tell this story in a children's book that I wrote a few years ago called Sugar and Milk. And it would be, I would be shooting myself in the foot if I told you the beautiful legend right now, because I want you to go out and buy a copy of Sugar and Milk. But if you ask me nicely, maybe I'll tell you that lovely story. But consequently, that's how we basically came to India. And what I will tell you is that the Hindu ruler who did allow them in had only one request or demand of them, which is that you truly adopt India as your home. And while we will allow you to keep a very distinct and unique culture alive, we also want you to assimilate. And I have to say that that's precisely what the Parsis did. And they were very, very influential in the creation and the building of modern India, especially the city of Bombay, which houses most of them. But one of the reasons I was interested in sort of revisiting this community is that there's a very sad aspect to all of this, which is it's a dying community. It's basically going to be extinct in a generation or so. And the reason for that is that Parsis are not allowed to, if you marry outside the religion, the children are no longer considered to be Parsis. And nobody is allowed to convert into the faith. So it's basically a recipe for disaster. And as you would imagine, there's a struggle between the old guard who would rather face extinction than be flexible, and younger people who think this is foolish, you know. But be that as it may, there's this existential crisis that's sort of going on. And I wanted the book, in part, to be a kind of homage or a kind of Valentine, if you will, to this very quirky, very eccentric, very colorful community that is facing a crisis, you know. So hence, Remy Wadia, the main character, is a Parsi.
Yeah. What opportunities are there for Parsi women versus a woman born in India without privilege?
Every opportunity that a Parsi male would have, and actually more. So it's an extremely progressive community. Mm-hmm. It's very cosmopolitan and very Western, if you will, in its outlook. And the honest fact is that Parsi women today are much more highly educated than the men are, and hold positions of power everywhere in corporate, you know, in industry, you name it. And so it's not the stereotypical, you know, fate of Indian women that, you know, most of us are familiar with. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's a very progressive community in terms of equal rights for women.
Can you tell us a little bit about your upbringing in India and what memories you have?
Yeah, so I came here when I was 21. So I was born and raised in the city of Bombay. Didn't know too much about the rest of India, to be honest with you. Bombayites are a little bit like New Yorkers, you know? We kind of think that the whole world revolves around the city, you know, of Bombay itself. I grew up in a middle class, perhaps even an upper middle class family. My father had his own business. So I came from people who were very much into industry and being productive and earning money and business and banks and, you know, that kind of thing. And I didn't really know any artists, or I didn't know any creative people growing up. You know, I was the kind of kid who was drawn to reading and books from a very young age. I started writing when I was maybe 4 years old. As soon as I could read and write, I was writing poems and things like that. But I didn't have any role models in terms of, you know, wanting to be a writer, for instance. And in the way that kids instinctively know things, I knew that it wasn't cool for me to go around saying I wanted to be a poet, you know, which was sort of my highest ambition in those days. I wrote poetry way before I started writing fiction. So as I got older, I did the next best thing, and I went around. By the time I was 7 or 8, I was saying I wanted to be a journalist. I remember an aunt of mine teaching me how to pronounce the word journalist. You know, I couldn't quite say it, but I knew that that's what I wanted to do. And I thought that because I kind of had a feeling that I wanted to build a life in words, and that somehow being a journalist was perhaps on the hierarchy of being respectable. It was perhaps a little bit more respectable than saying I wanted to be a writer or a poet, you know. And so.
Have you, so you came to the United States when you were 21.
21, yeah.
Have you traveled back to India
Yeah,
since?
several times, yeah.
What are some of the changes you've seen in modern India?
I can't speak for all of India, but I can tell you a lot about the city of Bombay itself. I mean, it's very different now. I mean, every single time we go back, I'm just struck by just the buildings that are going up. You know, all of old Bombay, you know, the beautiful old buildings that were only 4 and 5 stories tall are being torn down, and these really hideous, frankly, skyscrapers are taking their place, you know. And I know that there are other changes going on too. It's certainly, and this might, at the risk of sort of overgeneralizing, I think Indians today, young people, young Indians today, are much more nationalistic and proud of being Indian than, frankly, you know, middle-class people of my generation were, you know. In my generation, we were trying to get out and go to the West, you know. It's not, I mean, which is not to say that migration from India is not taking place today, but at least amongst my social circle in India, you know, most young people want to stay because there's so much opportunity there now, you know. And there's clearly a creation of a middle class, a huge middle class that wasn't so much the case when I was growing up.
Intergenerational relationships are a common theme in a lot of your stories. In your opinion, what do you think we learn from intergenerational relationships?
You know, I grew up in a household, and I lived with my grandfather, who sadly died when I had just turned 7 when he died. But I have such strong recollections and memories of him, even today, that I can't help but think that he really shaped me as a person. You know, I don't remember exact conversations with him or anything like that, but he was this very kindly, dignified presence in my life. And I think I'm a true believer that even more than the relationship between a child and his or her parents, the really wonderful, magical relationship in a kid's life is with the grandparents, you know.
Yeah. What do you think we're missing out on if we don't have these intergenerational relationships?
So I just got back from Italy, and it's a country that I find myself, even though there are huge gaps in between, going back to more than any other country. And I first went to Italy when I was 19 years old, and it changed me. And what changed me more than seeing the Sistine Chapel and all the things that you expect to change you was the concept of the piazza, right? And the piazza is just the public square where every evening local people empty out, right? And 4 generations of family members, so the teenagers are off in one corner of the square doing their thing, and the old people are sitting there, and the passerbys stop and talk to the elderly people. And what struck me about that is it's such a rich way to live because nobody gets to be lonely, And there is this epidemic of loneliness in this country, right? And I can't help but think that it's tied to the whole drug crisis that we are facing and all those things. I like to walk in the evenings, and when you walk in the evenings, what do you notice? What pours out of people's homes? It's not human beings. It's the blue glow of the television, right? So we are all in our little boxes watching TV night after night after night. And it doesn't have to be that way, right? People can choose to live in a different way. And I'm a great believer in that kind of communal stuff.
So I came across an article that you'd written in the Beacon Journal from 1994 called Angels in America. Yeah. Do you remember that one?
I remember that one.
And in that article, you talked about how your experience in America has changed your concept of what family is. You said, America, land of friendly strangers and large-hearted people, where a stranger becomes a friend in a heartbeat, where a new generation living away from hometowns and biological families has introduced a new concept, that of choosing your own family. Is that reflective at all in your novels?
Wow, that's a great question. I don't know. I hope so. I hope it is. But I'm trying to think of specific novels. I don't think that's a concept that I've revisited in my novels so much, but I certainly live that every single day of my life. As an immigrant who came here by myself to go to grad school, I had no choice but to form new families. And there are people in this audience today who I've known for close to 40 years. I mean, I'll get emotional if I talk too much about that, but they are my family, So
Yeah, I think the article was about your experience with Christmas.
And I think even Thanksgiving, right?
Yeah.
That basically what this article written, 100 years ago, basically says is that from the day I stepped foot in this country, I never, ever spent a single holiday alone because some friend or the other always invited me. For a long time, I was like the stray puppy that people just patted on the head and took in, and I always had a place to go for every holiday, and hence, obviously playing on the Tony Kushner play, the iconic play, Angels in America, I sort of thought, my friends are my personal angels in this country.
Your first short stories, essays, and poems were published in national magazines and newspapers in India at age 15.
Yeah.
Were there authors that inspired your writing as a teenager when you were writing early?
Yeah, but surprisingly, they were all American writers. I didn't read. This will stun you. I didn't read a novel by an Indian author until a week before I left to come to this country, when I was 21. A very dear friend of mine put a copy of Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children in my hand and said, read it on the plane, you know. And of course, I had a book, so I wasn't going to wait a week to read it. And I read it, and it blew my mind, because I grew up reading, you know, Steinbeck and Faulkner and Fitzgerald and people like that. And I knew I could probably map out California just from reading everything that Steinbeck ever wrote better than I could map out, you know, my own home city, right? And Rushdie was the first writer I ever read. I mean, we have the Brits and a post-colonial education system to thank for this, right? It's nothing that I'm terribly proud of, but it was just my reality. Rushdie was the first time I encountered names, Indian names in a novel, not to mention street names that I could recognize. I mean, imagine how odd that is, to grow up in a city, to live there till you're 21 years old, and to never see that reality reflected in the pages of a book, you know? So I'm forever grateful to that man, and I've said this before, that it was truly my good fortune that the first book by an Indian author that I read also happens to be a 20th century masterpiece, you know?
I was reading in your biography that you actually have a business degree.
Yes.
How
We
did
all
you?
make mistakes in our lives, don't we?
At what point did you realize that writing was more of your calling?
I knew that when I was 5 years old, but I just had a crisis of confidence when it was time to choose, you know, where to go for my undergrad. And I was convinced by people older than me, not wiser, just older than me, that I would be better off going to business school. And I was the world's biggest misfit, let me tell you, in business school.
As a distinguished university professor at Case, what kind of courses do you teach there?
Mostly creative writing and a lot of 20th and 21st century American lit.
How does teaching others inspire your writing?
You know, I find it's really interesting. I became a writer a professional, you know, novelist, just about a year or so before I got the job at Case. So I guess I was a novelist before I became a teacher. But now I can't imagine doing one or just the other, because they just seem to feed in ways that I can't truly quantify or explain to you. It feels like teaching and, you know, teaching is a kind of writing, oral writing, you know, and writing is a kind of, you know, linguistic, you know, something on the paper teaching. So they're very, very closely aligned and tied as far as I'm concerned.
Are you a hard grader?
I used to be. Yeah, I used to be.
I think I'd be intimidated taking your class.
I just had this core belief for a long time that I wasn't doing my students any favors to just give them all, you know, good grades if the final product was not. And when you teach creative writing, it's truly a dilemma, right? Because what are you actually evaluating? Are you evaluating progress that a student makes in the course of a semester? Absolutely, yes. But is that all you're evaluating? Does the final product, you know, despite all the effort in the world, if the final product is not good, what do you do? I have to say that after teaching on Zoom for a couple of years because of COVID, something in me has loosened up, you know, and I am not as tough a grader as I used to be. I have no idea if that's good or bad. I just know that I'm getting more sleep when it's time to grade, because it was always that, is this a B plus or an A minus paper that used to keep me up nights, you know? And I just give them the benefit of the doubt now, you know?
Well, let's talk a little bit about your recent book, The Museum of Failures. Now, I read that your inspiration for the title came from an actual museum of failure, which is in Sweden. Can you talk a little bit about that, or how the title resonated with you?
I read this article several years ago about this actual brick and mortar museum of failure. It's now closed, which the irony of that, we have to appreciate that. The Museum of Failure indeed failed. But I just read that article. It was a fascinating article. But the thing that grabbed me was just the name, and I immediately thought, wow, this would make a great title for a book. But I didn't have a book to bestow that title upon. So for about 2 years, I kept looking over my shoulder, like nervously, thinking another writer was going to beat me to it and steal it. And then when I was writing this book, it just fit. It just seemed like the logical title.
Okay, well, tell us a little bit about what happens in the Museum of Failures. Obviously, I know you want your readers to buy your book or read the book,
Right.
but can you give us a little synopsis of the story?
Yeah, so it tells the story of this youngish man. He's in his 30s, Remy Wadia, who, like me, grew up in India but came to the US to go to grad school and stayed. And there the similarities end. So when the novel opens, he's on his way to India. He and his American wife, Kathy, have decided to adopt a child from India. So he's on his way to India simply to meet the mother of his child-to-be. And while he's there, he realizes that his mom, with whom he has always had a very kind of difficult relationship, is ill and is in the hospital. So that's where the novel sort of makes this giant detour, where he finds himself sort of nurturing her, nursing her back to health. And as he's doing that, unexpected feelings of love and tenderness, feelings that he's not permitted himself to feel, just as a way of protecting himself against her, come to the surface. And he succeeds in bringing her home from the hospital, and then something happens, and he comes across this secret. And it's the secret that kind of upends his life and makes him reevaluate everything that he has held dear and believed all these years.
Yes, I loved how it was very unexpected. The story took a totally unexpected turn. But I have to say, I really like listening to your audiobooks, your books written in audio, because they're always narrated by like native speakers.
Right.
And I feel like it just really transports the reader. I don't travel much, so for me, it really like transports you to a different time and a different place because of your descriptive writing. You're truly gifted in it.
Well, also, I have been lucky in having really talented voice actors read the novels, right? That's helps a lot.
Yes. Well, that's were my questions for you, but I'm sure our audience has some questions they would love to ask.
Yep.
Let me come down here with the microphone. Yes, your question.
Hi. So when you want to grab a good book and just relax, which authors do you look for?
I love Jennifer Egan. Right now I'm on this tear where I'm reading or rereading a lot of Philip Roth. I like Ian McEwan quite a bit. Once in a while I'll pick up a book that I've read years and years ago. I have Salman Rushdie's Knife, his new book, on my bedstand right now, but I haven't read it yet. But these are, it changes also quite a bit. And to be perfectly honest with you, there are a few writers where I'll just read anything and everything that they write. But I think I skip more based on the book than necessarily simply following one author. And having said that, I would advise you not to do the same and to...
Other questions?
Okay, I'm going to do what the New York Times does every Sunday, which I just love, which is if you were having a dinner party, who would be the 3 writers that you would want to invite to your dinner party?
Living or dead?
What did you say? Living or dead? It doesn't matter.
Oh, well, 2 slots are then already taken, Toni Morrison and Virginia Woolf. And the third one, Probably Margaret Atwood.
This is probably a little bit of a silly question, but do you personally choose the people that read your audiobooks? And is it typical? Do they do all the voices? Or because in the Museum of Failures, right, you have male, female, young, older. So just curious about that.
Yeah, so it's a great question. And let me tackle the second part of your question first. So no, I'll answer it in order, and I'll tell you why in a minute. So I've been very lucky in that, and the publisher certainly doesn't have to do this, but at least for the last several books, they have given me a choice. So they basically give me a choice of maybe 3 or 4 names. Sometimes they'll even approach the voice actor and ask them to read an excerpt from the book. And then I'll say, and usually we are, usually one person so far anyways has always stood out, and the editor and I agree, and then we go with that person. With the Museum of Failures, it's one of I think I've only written 2 books that are almost exclusively told from a male narrative point of view. So we couldn't go to the usual person, the female voice actor who has read several of my last books. So they gave me samples from, I think, 3 different people. And the very first one that we read, it just so happened that this particular actor chose an excerpt where Remy is in conversation with his mom. And we had already discussed that we would need to hire more than one person, somebody to do the female part and somebody to read the male part. Well, this guy nailed both voices perfectly without, it seeming like a caricature. He didn't do some high-pitched, silly, feminine voice, nothing like that. But you could immediately distinguish between the 2 characters, and he just nailed it. So we were like, why should we even go down the list? I mean, and so that's how, in this particular instance, we had one person who did all the voices. And I think he did a great job with them.
Other questions?
Read so many of your books in Thrity. You might be my favorite of all. Really, I love you so much.
So if I asked you who the 3 writers at the dinner party would be, I'd be one of them?
You would be, you would definitely.
How
be
about
one.
if I take all 3 slots and I eat enough for all 3 of the writers?
And you wouldn't mind our American food? I think
No,
it
I
made
wouldn't
reference
mind it.
in the book
Yeah.
that. Anyway, what I love is when I read your books and you make so many references to Ohio. And I think to myself, is that because she's mainly just familiar with Ohio? Or does she really love Ohio? Or why is that?
All of the above. Yeah.
It just is so
certainly-
endearing. It just makes you feel like, oh, she's one of us.
Thank you. That means a lot to me.
It's
I would
really
like to be one of you.
Very
I think
sweet.
I am one of you.
Very sweet, yes. And did you get your first degree at Ohio State,
Yeah,
right?
I
and
did.
then
And then I got a PhD years later at Kent State while I
Yes.
was working at the Beacon Journal
Yes.
full time.
Thank you. Other questions?
I'm going to stand up because otherwise it's just a disembodied voice. I'm curious about how you handle time management, or don't you, to teach, to write, to do all the reading that you do. I mean, I can't do half of that. How do you pull it off?
With great difficulty and sloppiness, I must say. My first several books, I was really, really disciplined, and I used to get up very early in the morning. I mean, I've always had a day job, right? I've never only written. So I really had to manage my time very wisely. And I used to get up at 4:30, 5 in the morning, and I am so not a morning person, but I used to, and I would get as much writing as I could, depending on what that day held for me, and then I'd turn off the computer and go to work. And I have to confess that of late, I have not, for the last several books, I haven't been doing that. I'm writing in a much more disjointed way than I used to, which is just catch me when you can kind of thing. You know, anytime I have a half hour or 2 hours, I just write. But I think what saves me and what helps me is, you know, the connective tissue, even though the writing itself, the act of typing itself is more disjointed than it's ever been. But the connective tissue is that I'm thinking about my books all the time, even when I'm not actually typing. So it doesn't feel as choppy as it actually is. In my mind, it feels seamless. I don't know if that makes any kind of sense or not, but yeah, so that's the honest answer.
Okay.
I find that your characters are always so wonderfully filled out and real in that they're never perfect, and they have how in creating a character, do you base them off of people you know? Do you create them and then make sure they have this full flawed personality? How do you go about that?
So when I was a younger writer, I did base several characters, even in the beginning, not all characters, some of it. I mean, fiction ultimately is an act of imagination. But I did used to model them on people that I knew. I don't feel the need to do that anymore. For instance, I don't know Remy Wadia. You know, I don't know him. There's nobody in my life who's Remy Wadia. You know, there's nobody in my life who has this explosive family secret that they stumble upon. So I think the older I get and more experienced I get as a writer, I can veer away from that kind of reality and have it truly be an act of the imagination.
Our book club had read The Space Between Us, and we were just wondering, like, as an author, the way that novel ended, some people thought, well, she's going to step into the water and commit suicide because her life's just a train, wreck with everything. Or, like, how do you decide kind of how to end a novel? There's so many routes you could go, or even with her husband who had left with her son, like, you wonder as a reader, oh, is this going to, like, is she going to thread this back into this hard situation that she's facing? Right. I'm just curious, like, how do you decide which adventure to choose, like when you're ending a book?
Sure. Pretty much when my hands start cramping and I'm like, I'm done with this book. I can't write anymore. No, actually, all my earlier books, you pointed out something that's true, had these kind of very abrupt fade to black kind of endings, where it was truly up to the reader to decide what happens. I have to say, in the case of The Space Between Us, it stunned me for years because I would get these long, labored emails from readers saying, help, half of our book club thought, she kills herself. Will you play referee and tell us what really happened, And I once did, I actually spoke to a book club where this woman stood up and said that she belonged to a different book club where they had this practice of writing one additional chapter to every book that they read. And she told me what her chapter was, and it was about revenge, and 20 years go by, and Maya becomes a doctor, and the bad guy in that book meets with a fatal accident, and of course ends up in her ER, and she, like that. But so I used to model several of my early books on the kind of movies, frankly, that I love to watch. I love movies that just end on a dime and leave me thinking, wow, bringing my imagination to bear, right? Because ultimately, all creative work is a dance between reader and writer, between filmmaker and audience. We have to bring our own life experience to bear. But having had this kind of question asked of me more times than I would want to count, I think in my last few books, I have just chosen the path of least resistance and given a more definitive ending to some of my books. And I think that's true for, in fact, Museum of Failures, in my first draft, ended a full chapter before the way it actually ends now. And my agent literally threw the book at me and said, there's no way you're doing this. You're going to write that extra chapter and answer some of these questions and connect some of these dots. So that's, there's a lady here who's had her hand raised for, and I can probably just hear her if you don't want to run
Yeah,
up
but
and
I
down.
think everyone likes to hear the questions, so.
I was just curious how you chose for Remy's wife to be researching Byler's disease.
To be what?
Researching Byler's disease?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I don't remember. I'm sorry. You're right, she does. But is it because she goes to a conference or something? Is that what it? Yeah, I don't
I just
remember
am familiar with the disease.
Well, she works at a children's hospital.
Yes,
She's
yes.
a pediatrician. So
Okay.
I think I just gave her a specialty and I wanted her to come home. That's it. I'm remembering now. I wanted her to come home with a heavy story of what had happened in her day. And yeah, hence that. Yeah.
Do you miss working for a newspaper like you did for the Akron Beacon Journal?
Not so much. I thought I would. It was really one of my worries when I left. I thought it's going to feel really crummy to be home watching a real news event on TV along with everybody else instead of being out covering it. But I surprised myself. I think because I was so happy and am so happy being a teacher at Case that it's sort of taken its place, And as I said, teaching in some strange way feels like a creative expression also, very much so.
I agree it is. What do you think of the state of journalism today with the newspaper?
What journalism? I mean,
Okay.
Yeah, I do feel like it's not a coincidence that sort of the collapse of democracy and the collapse of newspapers as a unifying medium kind of dovetail one another. If you track it, things started going south for us as a country along the same time as the collapse of the newspaper industry happened. And it's a pity, So I for years and years I thought, why don't, the 200 newspaper publishers form a kind of consortium and rescue this industry? It would have been such a great public service, but they didn't.
Hi, I'd like to dovetail on that question. I was in journalism school, and it was who, what, where, when, why, and how, and the opinions were left to the editorial page.
Right.
And it seems like when things got hyped up, started getting hyped up, and opinions became rampant, that things started to decay. Is there anywhere that, in your opinion, you can still get some honest news?
Oh, God, yes. I mean, I subscribe to the New York Times and the Washington Post every single day, and I actually think they are doing some marvelous reporting, and I don't really see, I know that's the slam against both publications, their opinion pages might be quote unquote liberal. But in terms of their news reporting, I still think that they are doing some excellent work. And I'm sure there are newspapers all across the country. I mean, the one thing I will say to you that, you know, journalists have this rap for being dishonest and, slanting the news and all that. I can tell you with every fiber of my body that at least in my limited newspaper experience, I have never worked with a group of people who were more ethical and who had more integrity and who took their job more seriously than journalists did. You know, I think it's just really, really unfortunate that we have grown to believe that most journalists are dishonest and all of that. And I can't help but think that the rise of so-called cable news has bled into this, you know. I'm just talking about print journalism. And I think, I mean, I would trust those people with my, my bank account. I mean, that's how honest the people that I worked with were. We didn't so much as accept a cup of coffee when we went into somebody's office to interview them. You know, that was the standard. There was no written rule that said you couldn't accept a cup of coffee, but that was the bar that we set for ourselves, and all of us did that. So I hate it when people disparage journalists.
I have two questions. In the space between us and also the new book, in India, becoming pregnant without being married seems like such a shameful situation. So I was just curious if that's still the case in India or if things are changing. And my other question is, what was the hardest thing for you in moving to America from India?
The first question is easy to answer. The short answer is yes. You see very few cases of people having children out of wedlock, and I shudder to think, especially depending on your socioeconomic class, right? So if you're affluent, there are ways around it, right? But if you're poor, or if you're in the rural, if you're in the countryside, I think there's a lot of shame and stigma attached to it. The hardest thing about coming to America, I don't really know. I mean, I had a blast my first few years in this country. I'll tell you, I'll just tweak your question a tad bit. It wasn't the hardest thing for me personally, but perhaps the most interesting, or perhaps even the most disillusioning thing for me when I came here was I just expected. Remember, I was all of 21, right, when I came, so I didn't have a lot of life experience. But we had all grown up hearing about how, technologically advanced America was, how scientifically advanced the country was. I just expected the people to be like that. I thought I was leaving behind all the mumbo jumbo in India behind, right? That I was going to come and find this new breed of human beings who were rational and scientific and not superstitious and all that. And what I realized was it's the same everywhere. People are people. And it was just the same. And whatever, we may have iPads and iPhones, but the human brain and the human heart is still the same, So that was a bit of a downer in the beginning, But hey, I got used to it. Yeah.
Have you had students that go on to be journalists or write well-known books?
Not so much well-known books, but certainly we have students who have published books, novels, nonfiction, and most certainly have become journalists also. Yeah. Yes.
So, God forbid, if someone said to you that Thrity, you can only write one book, that's it. What would that book be about? Is there a subject matter that you feel you have not tackled yet and you would like to write about if you're given that choice?
I just wouldn't believe them. Yeah. No, but it's a great question, by the way. I think I'm going to write a book soon that's going to span a person's life in India over at least 40 years or so. And that scares me, which is one of the reasons I keep writing other books and don't write that book, because that's a long time period to compress into, a 350-page novel. And I haven't quite figured out how to do that. But I hope that I can write that book someday. I really do.
Was it challenging to write? You wrote 3 children's books. Was that challenging, being used to writing 300-page books to writing?
No, it was so much fun.
Fun.
I mean, it reminded me of, my childhood writing poetry. Because that's what children's books are. They're poems. They're just long poems. They're prose poems. But they have some of the traditions, if you will, of poetry, right? You have a refrain, you have some little bit of internal rhyming going on, that kind of stuff. So, no, I just really love writing children's books.
Other questions?
I'm wondering if you're ever approached by producers, agents, to turn your stories into a movie?
Yeah, several times. We've signed a lot of contracts. Several of my books have been optioned, but it's the age-old story, the money, It's very hard. I mean, look, my books are not, they're mostly about serious and perhaps even sad issues, and so they're not commercial in that sense. I've had some people who are just genuinely interested, and I know they would have done a very good job, but we just keep hitting that wall, and then the option runs out because it's a matter of. So if you know anybody who has, 15 million lying around, put them in touch with me, and we'll get a movie made.
Do you have a say in the design of your covers of your books?
No, not in the artwork and not in the design. They do, as a courtesy, they don't have to, but I think all publishers do this. They will run it by you just to make sure that you're good with it. And it's very interesting, though, when they send you the jacket for the first time, they always say, all of us at publishing house love this jacket. We hope you do too. It's always worded. It's like boilerplate language, right? I have on a couple of occasions, actually somebody talked about The Space Between Us. When it came out in paperback, they had this very cheesy jacket. And it was just unrecognizable. It was like a chick lit kind of a jacket, And I did speak up then and said, this is not my book. This just doesn't. Exactly. So they did. I have to give them props. They did change it and came up with what I think all of them finally agreed was a much better jacket and one that reflected the book a little better.
Other questions?
I have a question for the audience. Would you raise your hand if you are a member of an active book club? Wow. That was my guess. Thank you.
Other questions?
I think I have exhausted your audience into submission and silence.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. The Learned Owl is here selling copies of Thrity's book. We have Honor and the Museum of Failures. You can get your copies in the back. Thrity will be up at the front table here signing books, or if you just want to chat with her for a few minutes, you're welcome to do that. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight.